I'm Don Tipping, and it's late winter. It's just about the spring equinox here, and I, like many of you, have been hearing a lot about regenerative agriculture. And this term regenerative keeps popping up in all different kind of disciplines, whether it's economics or health, or people are putting it on just about any discipline. And it's the new buzzword of our time. For myself, the very first time I heard this word was probably over 25 years ago from my friend and colleague Penny Livingston, who's a permaculture teacher in the Bay Area of Northern California. And the way she depicted this was, at the time, we were all using the word sustainable for sustainable agriculture, or that we wanted to live sustainably or do things in a more sustainable fashion. And she said, if we look at this on a continuum, that basically sustainability is merely the midpoint between destruction and regeneration. And that really made a lot of sense to me, especially at the time, and to this day I've been practicing biodynamic farming, where we say conventional agriculture depletes the soil, sustainable agriculture maintains the soil, and biodynamic agriculture is looking to improve the soil. So what I wanted to share today was 5 myths about regenerative agriculture from my perspective of after over 30 years of being a full-time farmer. So the first myth I'd like to dispel is that regenerative agriculture is new. And much like my friend Penny Livingston once said, is that permaculture is just a new buzzword for an old way of being. And similarly, regenerative is just the new buzzword to describe an old way of being. And indigenous farmers, there was no conventional agriculture, so all farming was regenerative or sustainable or natural or whatever you want to call it, organic. Or like there's that saying that some of you have maybe seen in memes, is organic food. Our grandparents just called it food. So this idea that regenerative agriculture is new is really just a marketing campaign being applied to different areas to somehow differentiate people's products as better than. And I think that this movement has come about through the corporatization of organics. So when organic farming first started, it was seen as an alternative to conventional agriculture, and a way to get back to old ways of farming without synthetic chemicals, synthetic fertilizers, fungicides, and the other practices that are about the efficiency that came about in the post-World War II industrialization of our food system. But when we look back at other, we'll just say whole systems approaches to land management, whether it's holistic resource management from Alan Savory, or natural farming that was brought to us through the Japanese farmer Masanobu Fukuoka, or biodynamic agriculture that was started in the early 1920s from Rudolf Steiner out of Austria, or syntropic agriculture, which is sort of like the South American permaculture, or permaculture itself, which came out of the mid-1970s out of Australia. There are many different ways to describe holistic ways of doing land stewardship. So regenerative is just the new one. And we can look at this sort of greenwashing, whether it's natural, organic, or this non-GMO label, or all these kind of things. So while I applaud the use of the term regenerative, I think it's really important to recognize this is not a new approach. It's just a new term being used to describe a wide diversity of land management practices that don't use chemicals. I think that's a key distinction. However, because of the buzz marketing nature of the word regenerative, I was just at a meeting where I learned that the California Department of Agriculture is considering that regenerative agriculture can include growing a cover crop and then using herbicides like Roundup to kill it down so you can do no-till agriculture. And similarly, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, UNFAO, considers that no-till using herbicides can be considered regenerative agriculture for climate change goals. So buyer beware is that you are being sold a label for which there isn't a clearly defined set of terms. So my second myth, and this is really central to the whole regenerative agriculture thing, is that you can do no-till farming without chemicals, without herbicides. So you'll see that I just did a little research online and looking at the Rodale, Regenerative Organic, or numerous videos on YouTube, and they all talk about that if you're doing regenerative agriculture, you're not tilling. Well, I've been farming full-time for 30 years now, and I've experimented around quite a bit with trying to do no-till, and every single time I would chalk it up to a failure. And this is using various methods of machinery, whether it's having a cover crop and using a subsoil shank to cut a furrow to plant into. And you have to understand, most no-till in the country is where they grow up a cover crop of cereal grains, maybe some legumes, and then they use herbicides to kill that crop so that you have basically a mulch where nothing's growing. And then they'll use what's called a no-till drill, which is a large metal disc that cuts through that material that's on the ground. And then a seed planting device, a shoe basically, that's planting seed in through that. So that's what most no-till is. It's done extensively in dryland areas for cereal grains like eastern Washington, eastern Oregon, and the Great Basin. But to do it organically is really difficult because you have all these weeds out there, and weed control is the #1 challenge for organic farmers. We've been a certified organic farm for, this is year 29 here in southwestern Oregon, so I know a bit about this. And to do no-till without herbicides, I would say is next to impossible. And the people that I do see doing it are in very unique scenarios. Like, for instance, Singing Frogs Farm in Sebastopol, California, where they farm about an acre of intensive vegetables. And that area, Sonoma County, land is like $1 million an acre. Like, no joke. So they can sell their produce for a very high price, and they can get free composted manure, so they can lay that down on the ground this thick and then just plant into that. That's very different than no-till, and they can get ample interns and that kind of thing because you have a lot of young people that grew up in wealthy families that don't need to earn a living and they want to explore interning on a farm. So that's great for them. I'm glad it works for them, but to think that you're going to be able to do that where you live is perhaps misled. Another example would be Never Sink Farm, and they do a very similar thing, a very intensive, they call it no-till, but they're applying a lot of compost and then using a broad fork, which is like a very wide digging fork, to loosen the soil, which I would argue is tillage. But to think that you're going to grow a cover crop and then plant into that somehow and do no-till, good luck with that. Go ahead and try. Learn by doing. And I've done that every single way I've tried doing it over the years. It's failed, and it's resulted in lower yields or complete crop failures. And so I think inside of that, this is kind of expanding on this whole idea that of a myth of regenerative agriculture is the idea that tillage is bad. And I've been farming this land where I am here, we're going into year 25, and we've done a lot of tilling. And in order to grow a cover crop, you kind of have to till in order to establish small seeds in the soil. If you just go out there and spread cover crop seed on a pasture or in the weeds, you're going to get a very poor establishment of that cover crop. So tillage is as old as agriculture, and it's important to do your history, and I'll do a later podcast about flood retreat farming, and that most agriculture originated in what's called flood retreat farming. Basically, the Tigris, Euphrates, the Yellow River, the Nile River, the Brahmaputra, all those rivers of where agriculture started would flood and deposit all this nutrient-rich silt. And then it would also wash down seeds and tubers and rhizomes of plants that would grow up, and early agriculturalists were just out there harvesting this. And they didn't have to till, but basically this flood deposition was basically a disturbance akin to tilling. So our third myth is about incorporating animals into regenerative systems. So if you go out there and look on YouTube and the Kiss the Ground folks, they really highlight a lot of these regenerative rotational grazing programs, which is awesome. I think doing rotational grazing with animals where you're moving the animals around a lot with fencing is a way to keep your pasture lands healthy and vibrant. However, it requires a lot of land, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of fencing, a lot of know-how. You have to establish your stock. It's 5 years of spending a bunch of money and time and energy on labor and all this to get to that system. So yes, you can do this in those pasture-based systems, but if your farmland is expensive, like it is where I live here, where farmland is, I don't know, $30,000 to $50,000 an acre, not including the value of a house, it's going to be really hard to make money doing a rotational grazing type system. And another example is my friend and colleague Joel Salatin, who's over in Virginia, but he's farming, I think he's 3rd generation on the land, so he didn't have to buy the land, didn't have to establish the stock. There was a lot of infrastructure already set up, and I think they have over 400 acres. So most of us are not in that situation. So if you are, awesome. I wish you all the success, because that's great to be managing land in that way. However, what I want to bring up is myth number 3 is incorporating animals into a diversified farm system is very difficult, and you can trust me because we've tried to do it. I've had sheep and goats and different types of poultry that we've tried using electric fencing, a netting that's easily movable around the land with a little solar charger, so that we can incorporate our animals with grazing down cover crops or after a crop's harvested, like an annual seed crop like corn or beans or something, to be able to move the animals in there to eat what's left, and they can be depositing their manure right there. When it works, it's awesome. However, there is a significant portion of the time where an animal tests that fencing and pushes it over, and then all of a sudden you have a flock of sheep in your carrots or in your cucumbers or right there in your front yard. And I don't know anyone who's doing this successfully over the long haul. Maybe they'll do it for a few years when they're willing to be out there all the time or have an inordinate amount of labor and stuff. But incorporating animals, I do agree, is crucial to what any type of regenerative agriculture system you're aspiring towards, but it is a very slippery slope, and I personally have renounced electric fencing. We no longer use it here, and we only use permanent metal fencing systems to keep our animals out of our annual cropping systems. And then we gather their manure and make compost and apply it. So I just wanted to get that out there. You'll see a lot of fanciful stuff out there, but the reality is it's a lot harder than some 5-minute video on YouTube makes it out to be. So the 4th myth I'd like to dispel, and this comes out of the Rodale Regenerative Certified Organic label. They are the first and only that I know of organization that's trying to cohere what does regenerative mean. Because it could mean all sorts of things. It's a made-up word that conjures images of this, kind of fantasy farm type situation where everything's just perfect. So as part of the Rodale certification program, if you want to become a Rodale certified regenerative organic farm, for one, you have to be managing your land organically, which is no synthetic chemicals for fertilization, fungicides, herbicides, or insecticides. And here's the kicker, is that you have to pay your farm workers a living wage for your area. So that's a hard thing to figure out. Where is this information determined? We live in Josephine County, where they say for a single person with no kids, a living wage is $25 an hour. I don't know any farms paying that. And if you have a child, I was talking to a friend the other day, he's a single dad, and living wage for somebody that's a single parent is probably about $35 an hour to afford rent and everything else for our area. I don't know of any farms or ranches or vineyards offering that wage as a starting wage. So then are you discriminating against single parents, let alone families? So what really drove this home for me is I was recently at a farming conference in California, and there was a woman who was a flower farmer there who is looking into getting this regenerative certified organic seal of approval certification. And in Santa Cruz County, a living wage is $37.50 an hour. So in order for her farm to qualify as a regenerative certified organic farm, she would have to pay her farm workers starting wage at that level. That is a lot of money, I'll let you know. And I agree, I think we should be at that level of what we're able to pay people, but then it means we're going to need to charge people so much more money for the food, or she was a flower farmer. And in her instance, because the Santa Cruz area is a fairly well-to-do area, she had a community member step forward and they got a loan for a box truck. And instead of selling the flowers that they grow on her farm locally and supporting the local community, they're putting them in a refrigerated truck and they're driving them down to Los Angeles to sell them at top dollar so that they can afford to pay their workers. So is that really the kind of farm systems we want to have? I don't know, you be the judge. But I want to make this video so that you're more informed from somebody that's actually boots on the ground doing this work and in touch with other people who are doing actual farming and not some Hollywood version that looks good on YouTube. So the fifth myth I'd like to dispel is that there's no consensus of what the practices of regenerative agriculture look like. And I was even able to go to a field day at the Ecology Center, which is a farm, it's an urban farm that's a nonprofit, and some of their funding comes from donations from their community, and they're in an area where it's very affluent. Orange County, California, it's just south of Los Angeles, if you're not familiar, is probably one of the more expensive areas to live in the US. So they're able to have a farm right inside of that, which is awesome because we should be growing food everywhere. However, it's not a replicatable model unless you happen to live in a very affluent community. And so the reason I'm bringing this up is they did a field day because they're one of the pilot projects for this Rodale Regenerative Certified Organic model. And I'd like to add a caveat. I do think we need to strengthen our organic certification systems because there are tons of loopholes. And there's many large industrial organic farms that do this revolving door of they farm conventionally for a few years, then transitional organic, and then into certified organic, and then when the bugs and diseases get too bad, they go back to chemical farming and just keep that loop going. So that's most of the food at a big Costco or box store that's organic, that's how it's being grown. I hate to break it to you, same for all the animal products, whether it's dairy or eggs or meat, because the big guys got involved and they got to write the rules. So I applaud that Rodale is trying to create some standards, but I was at this field day at the Ecology Center and I started to press, there were other farmers in attendance there, and about, do you require the use of organic seed? What are your other, just the various bullet points, and they really didn't have it figured out. So it's very much a work in progress, and yet you see all over the place people marketing products as regenerative. And I'm here to tell you that at the ground floor level, they don't even really know yet. And when you get the California Department of Agriculture saying that you can use Roundup in a regenerative no-till system, then what does that mean? It's all being watered down. And so I'd like to close with a quote from a conversation I was having with my old friend Matthew Dillon, who has been a close friend of mine through the seed community for many years. And he was one of the founders and the executive director for the Organic Seed Alliance. Then he went on to work for Cliff Bar as their director of product sourcing, and now he is the executive director for the Organic Trade Association. And he said that we need to strengthen the certified organic label so that it actually has integrity. And what I'm talking about is that green and white circle that says USDA organic. But that's been heavily watered down. And he says we have to avoid the NASCAR version of a food system. And everybody who has shopped at any kind of supermarket knows what I'm talking about. You buy a product, whether it's coffee or chocolate or whatever it is, and you look at the package and it's got USDA certified organic, gluten-free, kosher, non-GMO, regenerative, like all these fair trade. There's probably a dozen different eco labels now, but what do they mean? And so the analogy to a NASCAR, if you've seen that great Will Ferrell movie of something, Talladasa, where he's driving the NASCAR and the entire windshield is full of sponsor stickers for all the different things, and you can only look out like that. And I think it's confusing for the consumer. What we really need is that organic, for those of us that have been doing it a long time, meant that you took care of the land. You took care of your forest, you cared about your watershed, you cared about what happened upstream of you, you cared about what happened downstream of you. It wasn't just instead of using bags that have a chemical tag on it, that you switch to using bags that have an organic tag on it. It was a holistic relationship with the land that also translated to your workers and how you treated your workers. It translated to how were you civically engaged in your community. Were you engaged with the local schools and churches and the gleaner communities and that kind of thing. And that, I think, is kind of Steve Solomon, who wrote this great book called Growing Vegetables West of the Cascades, Cascade Mountains for you, those of you unfamiliar, the volcanoes up and down the west coast here. He said there's big O organic, and that's what I'm talking about. Big O organic is that you actually believe in this holistic model of land stewardship. That really, that's what biodynamics is, that's what natural farming is, that's what permaculture is you have a broad understanding that biodiversity and all of these interrelationships was your true wealth. Where Steve Solomon said little o organic is just basically you're using organic amendments instead of chemical amendments. So in closing, be curious, stay open. It's a work in progress. We're probably even going to come up with a new word before too long because people realize that regenerative doesn't quite hit the mark. And first and foremost, get to know who is growing your food. And as I believe it was my friend Lane Selman from the Culinary Breeders Network, she says, because I'm a seed grower, so I'm concerned about seed growing, she says, put a face on the seed. Know who's growing the seed. So know who's growing your food. If you go to a farmer's market, you can do that. There's 9,000 farmers markets in this country. That's a way to cut out the middleman, cut out Costco, cut out Walmart, and give your money right to the farmer. And then if you're wondering how it's grown, you can ask them. And if they can't answer, then maybe find somebody else who can really stand behind their product. Because a true farmer loves doing this work, and they love working with the land, and they love growing things, and they should be enthusiastic about this. And that really is, I believe, what is at the core of this regenerative movement is people are hungry for that type of connection. That's the magic. And when you're going to a Costco or some big box store, that's lost. You're just looking at a label and you're trying to get a good deal. And you can see where that goes. It's a race to the bottom, in the words of Seth Godin. So thank you for your attention and your time, and please share this video with your friends if you think they may benefit from it, and stay tuned for some follow-ups about specific elements of regenerative. I'm hoping to have a friend who is a regenerative cattle rancher on. He would never use that word regenerative, but what he's doing is that. And begin to nuance, what does this actually look like from the human, animal, soil, elemental perspective? Because that's what we're talking about here. So stay good, stay open, and go grow something.